If you work as a manufacturing facilities engineer, installing a new piece of equipment can be as complex as the machinery itself. From prep work to alignment and testing, it's your team's job to put it all together. That's why it's good to have Grainger on your side. With industrial-grade products and next-day delivery, Grainger helps ensure you have everything you need close at hand through every step of the installation. Call 1-800-GRAINGER, click Grainger.com, or just stop by. Grainger, for the ones who get it done.
Cheers, Rockets fans. Welcome to The Logger Line, an exclusive podcast from the home of the Rockets.
Whoa!
Sports Talk 790.
Rockets!
The Logger Line is proudly served to you by Carbox Clutch City Lager.
It is good! Oh, yeah?
Red Nation, get ready. Get ready. The Logger Line starts now.
Welcome aboard.
Thanks for tuning in to another new episode of The Logger Line, as always served to you courtesy of Clutch City Lager of Carbach Brewing. I'm Ben Dubose, your host, editor of USA Today's Rockets Wire, and contributor to Sports Talk 790, the official flagship radio station of your Houston Rockets. I'm joined by my good friend, co-host, and producer out of Portugal, Paulo Alves, who you can follow on Twitter at Paulo Alves NBA. Me, I'm at Ben Dubose. So as we chat this Thursday, February 22nd, the Rockets are back in action tonight in New Orleans. After a much-needed week off for the All-Star break, the Rockets are much healthier. They've got Fred VanVleet, Cam Whitmore both set to return. Tari Easton is not, but I think we've known for some time that injury is more longer term. And if the Rockets are going to make something of this season, it pretty much has to start now. They're currently 24-30, 12th in the Western Conference, 3.5 games back at Golden State for the 10 spot, which will eventually be the final berth in the Western Conference play-in tournament. And these next 6 games are absolutely brutal. 4 are on the road, where the Rockets, they're just 5-21 this year, and all 6 are against teams who are currently in the top 6 of the West standings. You've got 3 against Kevin Durant and Devin Booker's Phoenix Suns. You've got 2 against MVP candidate Shai Gilgeous-Alexander and the Thunder. And then the one tonight on the road versus Brandon Ingram, Zion Williamson, and the rest of the Pelicans. So, as I see it, it's put up or shut up time. The schedule does ease up a little bit in March, but if you fall even further below 500, again, you're already 6 below as things stand, and then you drop 5 or more games behind the number 10 spot. At that point, it's probably too little too late to actually make a serious run. And yet, other than putting Fred back in the lineup, now in fairness, that will help. The Rockets are 1-6 without him this year, and I guess you're also going to add Cam Whitmore to your bench rotation. But other than that, there aren't going to be any major changes, at least not immediately. After that loss in Memphis, just prior to the All-Star break, Ime Udoka said he was considering changing the starting lineup, which we discussed on last week's pod. The obvious candidate was Jalen Green, who did not play at all in the final 18 minutes against the Grizzlies, and he's been benched in the fourth quarter quite a few times this season. And yet, at least for now, Ime and the Rockets decided to stay the course. As far as the rationale, we discussed the pros and cons in last week's pod, so we don't need to go into the same length we did then. For those wanting more depth, you can just check out our archives. The reason I ultimately came to the conclusion that they probably wouldn't make the move, and I have a suspicion this was at least part of the calculus for Ime, the juice just wasn't worth the squeeze in this case. For starters, it's not a playoffs or bust season. We've covered that plenty. It's not truly win now. In phase 2 of the rebuild, as the Rockets have repeatedly called it, you're still balancing short-term factors with longer-term considerations. And in this case, there's really a lot of long-term risk for what I don't think would offer a ton of short-term gain. Because it's not like we know 100% that Amen Thompson or Cam Whitmore, and I think Amen would be more likely, would be better than Jalen Green if you inserted them into the starting lineup. Their samples are still so small. Jalen has had some really encouraging weeks himself. If we're talking about small samples, it's just the overall sample with Jalen is big enough that we've seen plenty of lowlights and inconsistency as well. The same might happen with Amen and Cam as they get exposed more to NBA defenses and teams start to adjust more against them. But beyond that, what I kept coming back to is this. What exactly is the upside? Those guys are still on their rookie deals, so you've got so much time. And Ime's already shown a willingness to include those guys at the expense of Jalen in the closing lineups. So really all we're talking about is the first 6 minutes or so of the first and third quarters. Is sneaking a few more minutes for a men with Fred and getting whatever data or superior chemistry comes from that, is that really that important in the grand scheme? Again, he's under club control for 3 more years. You don't have to rush this. You can still get a lot of those same benefits if you go back to that a few weeks from now or a few months from now. Now, as I said last week, if it were a video game, yeah, I'd probably make the change. Gun to my head, I do think Amen and Cam have more long-term upside than Jalen at this point. And it's fair to acknowledge the Rockets have consistently had a problem with how they start games. In a perfect world, sure, you try something else out, and then if it doesn't fix it, you can just go back to Jalen later. But in real life, you've got to consider the human factors, and I think that's what's getting lost here. You absolutely would run the risk of mentally losing Jalen Green if he's the only guy you bench, and you do it all for an unproven rookie. And that side of it, at least on my social media timeline, is being way oversimplified for the sake of a cleaner narrative. I had someone in my mentions today saying, oh, so Jalen's going to throw a tantrum? That just proves he's a head case and not the guy. Sorry, as I see it, that's naive, it's overly dramatic, and above all else, it's overly simplistic. He might not throw a tantrum, he might not demand a trade, but you do run a real risk of undermining his trust in the organization. This is a guy who was the number 2 overall pick less than 3 years ago, a centerpiece of your rebuild. And over this past year, you've asked him to undergo so many changes. New head coach, new system, new role. And it's not like he isn't trying. He is making better reads. He is defending at a higher level. Ime and veteran players like Fred, they've consistently said that all year. It's just the jump shot and the efficiency is not where it needs to be. It's as simple as that. And maybe it never is. But what do you really get from pulling the plug early? Again, I don't think the potential upside of the alternative is all that high. But to get back to the point, which, as I see it, is Jalen's state of mind. Anyone who thinks that most starting players in the NBA wouldn't have a problem with being benched for an unproven rookie under these circumstances is being extremely naive. Now, maybe if the Rockets just hypothetically traded for a Mikal Bridges at Jalen's spot, as had been rumored, but not for an unproven rookie. You're just living in a utopia if you think most players would just say, I should have played better. I completely trust the coaching staff. I believe in every decision they make. And, well, if they think somebody else is better, they must be right. And I'm just going to take it on the chin. And I'm going to try harder off the bench. That's just not the modern NBA. I'm sorry. And really, I don't think it's modern sports. It's the player empowerment era. Almost every player thinks he could be better if he was used in a different way. That's a huge factor in why there's so much player and coach movement around the league. And yes, some do take it to extremes, like the infamous KPJ incident where he threw soup in Cleveland, or when Christian Wood refused to check into a game when Steven Silas infamously benched him a couple years ago. I don't necessarily think that Jalen would go to those extremes. But in a season that's all about building the right habits and shaking those losing habits, Ime has said that time after time, the state of mind for a player like Jalen, it's not an insignificant variable. Even if Jalen is professional enough to accept a demotion without going nuclear, there's still so many questions when it comes to his attitude, his work ethic, whether he's bought into that role. And it's the job of organizational leaders to consider those types of factors. Now, I will say that if you're already fully convinced that Jalen just is not going to work out and that he won't cut it as a starting level player on a contender a few years from now, then sure. In that scenario, you may as well make the change now because there's just not enough upside to staying the course. But I don't think the Rockets view this as an all or nothing thing. And I don't either. You don't have to choose between either I fully believe in Jalen, he's the starting 2 guard on a contender a few years from now, or I'm all the way out, this guy's a bust, it's time to move on. There's plenty of middle ground scenarios where you can have valid concerns, but you can still see the talent of a guy who just turned 22 years old, still not even through his 3rd NBA season. You see stretches of super encouraging play like that untradeable tour, as we called it, not even a month ago. And you want to play this out just a little while longer to get more information. To me, if you believe in Jalen's potential even a little bit, then the upside of keeping him in the best frame of mind to keep growing, to keep pushing forward, all that stuff, there's just more upside to that path and seeing what happens than there is to sneaking a few more minutes early in the 1st and 3rd quarters for Amen Thompson or Cam Whitmore, all in a year that isn't really about winning now in the first place. And again, it's not even that we 100% know Amen would be better. Finally, last thing I want to say in this little rant. On the subject of fans mistakenly viewing things as all or nothing, I also want to push back on the fallacy of this path not having accountability. Seriously, Jalen has been benched in the fourth quarter several times this year. And in many cases, including the most recent game, he was the only starter it happened to. He knows. This whole storyline over the past week with Ime airing publicly that he was considering a change, everyone in that locker room knows who it would have been. As we discussed last week, there was only one realistic option. That in and of itself is quite a statement to make publicly. It's not as simple as saying either you bench him altogether for an unproven rookie or there's no accountability and you're just catering to a head case. There are plenty of intermediate steps. And in my opinion, this is the Rockets looking at maybe doing one or two more intermediate steps before taking the more drastic one. Now, I'm not going to tell you that for sure they're right. If you're all the way out on Jalen, I understand why you'd want to pull the plug now. Or Paolo, you could make the argument like you did on last week's pod that maybe benching Jalen as a Hail Mary on the small chance that it works as shock therapy is worth trying. But then, as we talked about after you made that argument, even that plan requires an implicit admission that we're at a point now where the status quo just is not going to work, and so it's worth risking the entire thing blowing up. I just don't think the Rockets are quite there, at least not yet. And I just don't see the harm in waiting a few more weeks. Again, we're not even 2 months until the end of the season to make such a serious, sweeping judgment. So for me, it's a defensible call, and it's one I largely expected, even if the basketball fan in me was sort of hoping for a men to start just to see what it would look like. Not telling you it's clearly the right move, just that I understand it and I see where they're coming from and I can respect it. I also think if you take a step back and you compare this situation to another team, any non-contender who, let's say they have a recent number 2 overall pick, putting up the numbers that Jalen currently is, and the alternatives for his starting slot are rookies like Amen and Cam that have a very small sample. I don't think we'd say, wow, this team has got to make a move immediately or they're incompetent. No, what I think we'd say if we were looking at it impartially is, okay, the trend lines are concerning, but it's probably still a little bit early. They may need to do this change down the road, but we wouldn't bat an eye if they don't do it now. The reason we're acting like something has got to give right now is because we're diehard Houston Rockets fans. We are tired of seeing this team lose. We want something to change. And so the emotional side of us knows that this is the easiest thing you could conceivably tweak in your starting lineup. And a lot of people just want to see that for the sake of making a change and hoping it sparks improved play. The Rockets organizationally can't just be about the emotional side. They've also got to think strategically. They've got to think practically. And that's where I think when you balance not just the short-term considerations, but the longer term, the development, I understand why they're not doing it right now, even if on some level it might have felt good to make the move coming off the All-Star break. Paolo, those are my, I guess, long-winded thoughts about today's announcement. Where do you come in on all of this?
Yeah, I guess I'll approach it from a different angle. We obviously went through a lot of the angles of this in the last pod, just went on with a few different ones. I guess I'll approach it from the what about the rest of the team, right? Because we've talked about Jalen.
Okay.
We've talked about, a lot of stuff. What would the impact be on the rest of the team? And I think that there's an argument to be made just to both play devil's advocate and play devil's advocate to the devil's advocate. I guess I'll call it, I'll call it heaven's advocate or whatever the fuck it is. So there's two scenarios, right? There's Jalen doesn't take it well, and he starts a fuss, and he comes on publicly and he's bashing the org or spreading, because if players are not taking it the right way, and they're going to do something like that anyways, chances are they're going to leak stuff that's not favorable to someone and it's eventually going to come out in the media. Same thing with Russell Westbrook when he asked out, or James Harden when he asked out. Even players that are, that even like the organization or once did, they'll just air out some dirty laundry. So if things go wrong with Jalen, you can expect some things to come out on the media, and if he is as pissed off as it would look like, it's likely that there'd be some disturbance from that. How would the rest of the team react to it, right? How would becoming a public kind of, the butt of the joke publicly like they've been the past 2 years, how that impact the team, how that impact Ime Udoka's profile moving forward, how that impact the way, the team's viewed publicly. I think there's an argument to be made that it would also impact the team negatively, and things that would translate on the court via the public view, if Jalen, got sour about being benched, which it seems like a pretty reasonable outcome that things could go that way if he did get benched. So there's that downside. Once again, I'm trying to approach this from a different angle from what everybody else is saying. I've made my peace with it. I've said my thoughts on it the last pod. I'm just trying to add a couple of layers on this. This might be perceived as me kind of reaching, but it's exactly what it is. I'm trying to look at different angles. The other side of it is, if Kevin gets benched, it could be perceived as if Kevin doesn't get benched, actually, sorry. It could be perceived by the rest of the team as, hey, this guy is unbenchable, right? There's nothing I can do. No matter how well I play, I'm never going to get his spot as long as he's here, at least for the season, because he basically can't play any worse than he already did, and the team could not be in a worse spot than it currently is. And I still can't get the spot. And that's also negative. That's also negative. So as I said, playing devil's advocate and then playing the other side. So benching him could be a problem if a public feud arises from it. Not benching him could be a problem if you pass the message on to the team that no matter what he does, he's not going to get benched as long as he, is somewhat at least trying, even though he's not playing well on the court. So from those two angles, I guess it would be up to what do you think is more likely that would have happened. I made my case last part that I'm at the point where I probably would have burst the bubble and just seen what happens. But I can also understand with a team that has had as much trouble with the outside view of the team as the Rockets have had lately. Not only are you avoiding any risk that Jalen comes out with stuff that might have happened across the last 2 years, because players, when they're mad, they do that. You are also, and this is going to be kind of ruthless, but if the season goes wrong, I think most people will point to, hey, Şengün had a big breakout season. Ime Udoka got these guys playing defense. They still have so somewhat decent defense or defensive rating. I think they're fifth or something like that. And Cam Whitmore showed promise. Man Thompson showed promise. Tyrese, while he was healthy, was awesome. Jabari Smith looks like a much better player. And the national view from a 10,000 foot view, which is what the national media is going to do to a team that doesn't make the play-in, it will look like it's all Jalen's fault. And once they change Jalen, things might be on the rise. So he can kind of be used as a scapegoat if you keep him starting. If you don't, and you bench him and things continue to go poorly, now it's a different question. What else is wrong with this team? Once again, none of these arguments hold that much weight, just trying to view it from a different lens. So when trying to overcomplicate it, I can see ways in which it could have gone either direction. But at the end of the day, I think the simplest is just to not bench him and hope that he plays better. Hope that potentially Tyrese coming back gets the team back to a more decent state. Hope that the week off got Şengün back better from his back injury. Got VanVleet better from his back injury. Got Dillon Brooks, hopefully fully recovered from what his ankle injury was. Because I'm hoping that it was the ankle injury that I was holding back his defense since he's come back. And so
the oblique injury, you mean, with Dillon?
Yeah, sorry, right. I was getting that mixed up.
Yeah.
So just you hope that those things get better and you keep the status quo. And I guess the last outside chance case that you can make is it might be too early to sort of burn another one of your prospects by slotting him into a starting lineup. That honestly too early, and that none of them really fit into perfectly. Right, Cam's going to struggle defensively at the 2, if for nothing else, just from a off-ball defense standpoint. I think when he has the ball handler on him, he can play defense to a decent level, but he does fall asleep a lot on rotations. And so the team could, and it's not exactly the perfect setup for either guy. I mean, obviously with the spacing, I don't even need to make the argument again. They would probably be better than Jalen, but there's a chance that they wouldn't. And
Right.
you'd be putting that responsibility on them perhaps too early. And you don't really want to, I don't think you really want to do that during the rookie seasons. Maybe spot starts here and there.
But you've got so much time with those guys. You do not need to rush it. That was the perspective for me. There's just not enough juice for it to be worth the squeeze. Now I keep going back to that analogy, but it's true. There's just not enough upside to starting either of those guys now to be worth all those other risks that we've been outlining.
Yeah. So basically, as far as this topic goes, we can discuss it further. We're not going to be saying anything new, and
Right.
it's not going to change. I'd expect until at least the last 2 weeks of the season, in case we're out of the play-in race, and we may be just tanking at that point, and maybe they start at that point. But yeah, I think moving forward, knowing that Jalen's going to start, I think we have other stuff that we need to talk about as far as how the team's going to bounce back, because there were some other news in the Ime Udoka press conference.
Right, and you transition to it well with your focus on the rest of the team and what it might mean for them, because part of Ime's rationale, and he had an interesting attempt at framing this season that I hadn't really considered. So the Rockets have played 54 games. They're 24-30. And if you split it in half, that's 27. And that's basically the breaking point of this season. They had played 27 games before Christmas. They were 15-12. And their prior game, the last one before Christmas, that is, was probably their best of the entire season. That win at New Orleans, where Şengün had a career high 37, just went off down the stretch. Jabari was excellent as well in that game. And at 15-12, it felt like they were way ahead of expectations. That was the high water mark. Then the next 27 games started with the Indiana game on the 26th of December, and that's when Dillon strained his oblique. And Ime made the point that Dillon, over these next 27 games, where obviously things went off the rails, they went 9-18. Dillon missed 9 games. Fred missed the last 5 with the adductor, and he also missed 2 with a back injury or back-to-back considerations. And as we've talked about in the past, I suspect that's why Fred had a bit of a down January. And hopefully by resting the adductor strain, he also got to rest his back and heal up. Because if you get 100% healthy Fred VanVleet back, hopefully it's the version you had in November and December, not the version you had in January, where even when he played, it felt like he was a bit limited in terms of what he could give you, especially on that. Well, I shouldn't say especially on offense, because no, it was defense as well. We talked about him being nowhere near as dynamic at stopping dribble penetration. So I guess it was across the board, which makes sense if you have a stiff back. And so hopefully that's healed up over these past couple of weeks as well, just sort of using the All-Star break to stack rest on top of missing the 5 games before. But to go back to Ime's point about the team as a whole and these last 27 games where it went off the rails, you had Dillon missing 9, Fred missing 7, Jabari missed 4 with multiple ankle sprains, and then I think the final 13 games he shot like 28% from 3. So I have a sneaking suspicion that even though he returned, he wasn't 100%, and that may have taken a toll on his jump shot. And so the point that Ime was making in saying those things was that it's not just about Jalen Green, that the downturn was about a lot of different things that happened to that starting lineup. And now if you put all the pieces back together, maybe you can get something closer to the first 27 games. Now, it is also important to acknowledge that those 27 games that the Rockets went 15-12 in, a lot of those featured Tari Eason, especially in December when he was at his best. And as of now, the Rockets still do not have Tari. And at this point, we've talked about this in the past, I'm looking at anything from Tari this season as a bonus. At this point, with how tricky that leg injury has been, going back to the stress reaction he suffered in the preseason, it would not shock me if he did not play again this year. Ime did not rule out that scenario at today's practice. And if that's what needs to happen for him to be healthy long-term, then it's worth it. You've made that argument in the past, Paolo. But the flip side is that the first 27 games, when the Rockets were 15-12, had basically nothing from Amen Thompson or Cam Whitmore other than garbage time. They did not contribute to wins at all. So while you can definitely point to, and say, hey, this rosy scenario, we're talking about you're healthy again, at least with your starting lineup, and that's why you give the starting lineup a little more runway before you make a drastic change, such as benching Jalen, well, then you don't have Tari as insurance off the bench. Yeah, that's true, but you also have Amen Thompson and Cam Whitmore, both in very good form at the moment, whereas in those first 27 games, you didn't have them at all. They just were not ready. And well, maybe Ime was ready, but he was hurt. So same difference. He just wasn't able to give you anything at that time. So I guess my question for you, Paolo, how much of an impact do you think getting for now Fred and Cam back, hopefully at 100%, will make? Is it enough between those two getting back and hopefully Jabari getting healthier over the break with his ankles to where you have hope that they can find what they were in those first 27 games rather than the second? And by the way, it's worth noting those first 27 games, for most of December, Jalen was at his worst. So they were 15-12, even with about half of that sample being the absolute worst possible version of Jalen Green. Not that he was great in January. Well, he was for about a week or two, but overall it was much better. So I guess that's a potential upgrade source as well, that maybe Jalen has grown since that 15-12 stretch. And so I guess, the one bit of cold water, again, that you have to throw on this is the lack of Tari Eason, who is a very good player even in year 2. But it sounds like part of the rationale for Ime is taking a step back and saying, hey, as bad as these last 27 games have been, there were some clear inflection points with injuries that might be solved now that you've got Fred and Cam back. Hopefully Jabari and Dylan are healthier when it comes to the ankle and the oblique. How much do you buy into, Paolo, this idea that health in and of itself can potentially give this starting lineup a boost in a way that obviously they weren't able to get for much of January?
First of all, I like to start off by saying that I don't think we've been particularly unlucky with our injuries. I think a lot of people are crediting, are saying like, oh, we've had so many injuries. Listen, every team has those injuries. Teams that they have way bigger salary cap percentages allocated to certain players have lost those players and have managed to steady the ship in between time. So I don't think we've been particularly unlucky. As far as your question, it could be, but I honestly think that Tari Eason has such a massive impact that it probably won't.
Okay. You don't buy him in and Cam being good enough to offset that. Not yet, at least. I think
each of them brings like something specific that they do a lot better, or that we really need that they do really well. A man with his defense and rebounding, and Cam with his scoring, but both of them have holes in their games that
Tari doesn't have.
Yeah, and I think that they have. I think Tari right now, and I think and analytics back this, Tari is a massive plus on this team, and those guys are close to a small plus because of what they are lacking in their games, which is natural as rookies. And the other factor that factors in to, well, that was poor wording, but the other factor that factors in is we don't know how much healthier they're going to be compared to what they were during the second quarter of the season where the Rockets have been struggling. I'm not sure how much better Fred VanVleet's going to look.
How much will this week really do is the question.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So considering all of that, I'll just hedge my bets and say I don't think those would offset. I will reiterate my point that even if they don't, I'm not rushing Tari Eason back under any circumstances. If there's any chance of of him having long-term health issues because of this, I'm not taking that chance. And listen, the comp for him, which is not really a comp, but it's more like a dream, but there's some similarities there, is Kawhi Leonard, who is an awesome player that we've seen ever since he was 28, has struggled with the lingering, knee issues for him, but leg, like lower leg or leg issues that have really taken away from what could have been an even more legendary career. And he's not done yet, but we know how much better Kawhi could have been if he were just healthy all the time. And I just don't want to run that risk with a player as important as Tari. So just reiterating that, I guess I'll close my answer with that, and I'll ask you back a question. Do you think Tari Eason is so Tari Eason has been the only really long-term injury that this team has had this season, right? He's been out for a very extended period of time. Do you think he's the worst player it could have happened to for the Rockets? Do you think is there anybody else on the team that you wouldn't rather have had those injuries or have missed that many games instead of Tari. I know that there's a lot of negatives compounded onto that sentence, but I think you got what I meant.
Yeah, no, there's one that's more, and it's Şengün, simply because there is zero replacement for what he does and the burden he carries on offense. I know the defense has slipped, but when your alternatives are Jeff Green and Jock Landale, just in terms of filling the minutes at center, and then when you look at how much this team has struggled to generate offense all season long, I don't know how you get through the 54 games they've gotten through without the workload that Şengün has taken on from a playmaking and a creation perspective, not just for himself, but for his teammates. I just shudder to think at what the percentages might look like if, say what you will about Dylan Brooks, but he is shooting better than 40% or close to 40%, I think, on threes. He did have the bad game in Memphis that might have put him just below 40, but it's the best shooting season of his career. A lot of those are because he's getting really clean looks off either passes from Şengün or the attention that Şengün draws. So I would say simply because of the way this team is constructed and their offensive limitations, I think I would rather be without Tari than Şengün, but it's close. And after Şengün, I don't know. I mean, I guess you can argue Fred as well. They are 1-6 without him. But the fact that we're talking about a guy who got a max contract last off season and Tari even being in the same discussion as far as how impactful the absence is, that says a lot in and of itself. I think definitely Şengün, maybe Fred, although with the men playing better and Aaron Holiday's had a better year than expected, you could at least make an argument that Fred's a little easier to replace, although the wins and losses certainly don't show that. But yeah, I would say Tari is either 2 or 3. And for a guy in year 2, like that's a pretty amazing statement in itself. A guy who was drafted number 17 overall in the 2022 draft. So is that a fair answer?
Yeah, I would agree. I actually, when I asked the question, I completely forgot about Şengün, but I do agree with you. Şengün would have been a bigger loss. And I think you hit the nail on the head with your last sentence, which is how telling is that, or how much of a compliment is that Tari Eason, as a role player, which is what he is at this point, he could become more in the future. His impact is so big that he's close to what he's close to as much of a positive as the best player on your team, which is Alperen Şengün. I would say I would put him above Fred. I think Fred's important, really important, but I think a man not early on probably, but Tari also played a little bit of the early season. I think they could have realistically went after someone, or Aaron Holiday could have played there. They could have, I think made up for that difference a little bit better than what they can with Tari. It's because Tari is so unique that there's no.
Yeah,
I
he
don't
can
think
fill so many holes.
there's no other player in the league that is as much of a plus because of the things that Tari has. Tari is a great on-ball defender. There's great on-ball defenders in the league. Tari is also an insane rebounder, and he can knock down threes, and he has a little bit of a handle, and he's become better at finishing at the rim. I really truly do not think, other than stars, that there's anybody in the league right now that has the same skills that Tari has, especially because of how active he is. Like usually, if you're going to not to turn this into a Tari's and rant, but usually if you're a really good on ball defender, you're not a good off ball defender as a wing, or you play very good straight up defense, but you don't get a lot of steals and you don't get a lot of turnovers. And when you do, you usually are not an insane rebounder to compound on top of that. Or if you are all of these things, you usually can't shoot, or it's just such an all-around game for Tari that it's just insane the level of impact that he can have. And that's why, to me, it's just so important that they don't burn anything from his future to invest into this season.
Yeah. And to your point on Tari's versatility, basically had jack of all trades. We let off the pod talking about keeping Jalen in the starting lineup. A big part of why the Rockets were able to sustain themselves during that December burst, even with Jalen playing relatively poorly, was because Tari had, surprisingly, the handle and the fluidity on the perimeter to play in place of Jalen in a number of those games when the Rockets needed to sort of hang on down the stretch. And for various reasons, Ime felt like he couldn't trust Jalen. Tari became a Jalen insurance policy. I don't think going into the year we would have really expected that, because you think of Tari as a front court piece, and you look at him even as a or even a small ball five at times because of a weak side shot blocking ability and his instincts and his motor, but he's also taken clear strides as a playmaker and with his handle and played as effectively a two at times in certain lineups. And so based on that versatility and the ability to use him in so many different constructs, then yeah, that loss is especially brutal for this team. And so because of that, even though Amin and Cam have played well, especially by rookie standards, I think I generally agree with you that even having Amin and Cam, it does not offset not having Tari. So as long as Tari isn't out there, even if you do have Amin and Cam, you're probably still swimming upstream when it comes to trying to recapture the prior form. There's just so many variables. And, there's also a question of whether the week off or 8 days off, whatever it's been, is truly enough, or if it's going to take longer than that for soft tissue injuries like Fred in his back and Dylan in the oblique and Jabari in his ankles to fully heal. By the way, I think that's another factor in not wanting to bench Jalen unless they absolutely can't avoid it, is that there are a lot of other reasons why the Rockets are losing games. It's just in terms of changing the starting lineup, Jalen is the easiest to change politically and because there's a clear drop-in replacement that's still a part of your longer-term future. Yet when it comes to his buy-in and those intangible factors that we referenced earlier, it's tougher to get that buy-in if it looks like he's the only one being held accountable, that he's being scapegoated, even though we all know that the reasons this team has underperformed or regressed or whatever you want to call it are far more than just Jalen. And so I think that's why Ime and the Rockets are a little sensitive to making it look like it's just a Jalen problem and you fix that hole and there you go, it's fixed even without Tari. No, there's a lot of reasons why this team went from 15-12 in the first 27 to 9-18 in the next 27. And, basically you can cut the season in thirds, first 27, middle 27, and now the last 28. So let's think optimistically. I think at this point, we all know a play-in run is very unlikely. It's not impossible, but ESPN's Basketball Power Index has it at 2.1%. So 98%, it's not going to happen. The damage has been done. You're 3.5 behind a surging Golden State Warriors team that has future Hall of Famers all over the place. It's going to be very difficult. Yet it's not like there's nothing to play for. I think, finishing closer to 40 wins than 30, that would mean a lot when it comes to the baseline going into next year. And if you finish this last third similar to the first third, then I think when we look back at this season, it's easy to say, hey, like that middle third was exaggerated based on the injuries and some bad luck. And you can sort of go into this offseason knowing that, hey, when you're healthy, this is a team that simply based on the form of these players right now is in the range of 500, just as is. And that's before you consider internal growth or any external acquisitions. On the other hand, if you have another 9-18, or I guess 9-19 or 10-18, whatever it may be, stretch over these last 28 games, then it starts to look like, well, maybe it's the first 27 that were the outlier and this team is further away than what we wanted to think a month or two ago. So there's a lot to play for, even if the play-in is admittedly a long shot, especially with how difficult the last or the next 6 games are going to be before the schedule finally eases up a little bit in March. So as we close out the pod, I want to ask you, and I'll offer mine first. We did not compare our answers to this before the pod because I wanted to go in blind and see if we have the same answer or different. But what is the biggest individual variable over these last 28 games? Because at a team level, I think it's pretty obvious what's to play for. And I just laid out, I think, a lot of how the final record is going to influence how you feel about this season. Even if we can see that a play-in run is unlikely no matter what, there's still a lot to be determined about the narrative of this season, what it means moving forward based on how they finish in this final third and whether it's closer to the successful first third than the very unsuccessful second third that just wrapped up leading into the All-Star break. That's at the team level. And in some ways, the team, I guess, record at this point is a little less important anyway, because even though, yeah, it'd be nice for the narrative, look, you're not going to make the playoffs this year anyway, so it's not like you can spin it as a rousing success, even if they get to, 39-43, 40-82. I mean, it's nice growth, tremendous year-on-year growth, but it's not where they wanted to be and where I think as recently as Christmas felt like they would be with regards to the team level. So I think with this year, and as we said leading off, it's not a win now season regardless. It's just phase 2 of the rebuild, still relatively early on. So in the bigger picture, it's more about the individual development. What players take strides and don't take strides, what players work well together, what ones don't. Jalen is the easy answer, but I'm not going to go with Jalen simply because at this point, I don't know that there's anything he can realistically do other than looking like SGA or Devin Booker consistently for the last 28 games. And I just don't see that as realistic. That's going to make you feel that different about him going into the offseason. I think the issues with inconsistency and whether you buy into his ability to eventually shake those, I think at this point, it is what it is. There's nothing that he's going to be able to do over this closing stretch to dramatically change his value. For me, the one guy I am looking at is Alperen Şengün, because the last month has not been pretty. The defense has regressed. The offense has a little bit as well. And yet, if you squint hard enough, if you look at it glass half full, you can 100% make a case that he was overused. They had to rely on him even more than they expected over the first couple of months of this year, with Jalen not doing what the Rockets expected, with Tari being in and out of the lineup. They had to lean on Şengün so heavily. And we also know going into the All-Star break that Şengün was having his own issues with back problems. And just as we mentioned, the All-Star break giving Fred a chance to heal up his back, hopefully the same is true with Şengün. That can definitely, for a big man, have a lot to do with how physical you are around the rim and how willing you are to throw your body around and go after those hard rebounds. But I think you can go back to as recently as early January, and we had a pod about whether Şengün was a max player this offseason. If his last 2 months go as the last, I guess, month before the trade deadline did, I don't know that I feel that way anymore. And that's not to say that my previous analysis was given too hastily. No, because it was based on a much larger sample. What I'm saying is that if you combine the last month with 2 more months just like it, and all of a sudden it's not just like, oh, he hit a rough patch and he eventually got his second wind after the All-Star break, but maybe teams around the NBA actually did adjust their coverages to him and Şengün didn't have the counters, then at that point, maybe you do have to say, if you're the Rockets, yeah, maybe we got to wait until after year 4. He has the lower cap hold anyway, since he was a mid first round pick. And we've got to see more in terms of what strides he can make defensively. Offensively, we know he's very good, but can he be truly great? There's a lot to be written about the future of Alperen Şengün based on how he finishes this season. And that's for a player who right now is the best player on your team. And even with a guy who's as good as Şengün has been this year, and we talk so glowingly about, there's still a lot to prove, especially when we consider how much of a struggle it was for him, especially defensively, over the month leading into the All-Star break. So in terms of individual storylines, for me, the biggest thing to watch for is a Şengün bounce back and whether he can recapture the form he had. I would say about mid-January onward was where it felt like he really started to slip, especially defensively, but some on the offensive end as well. Paolo, is there anything you wanted to add on that front? And is there any other storyline that you're looking at on an individual level that might be similarly important?
Yeah, I would have gone with Şengün. Jalen's too easy, so I'll go with something else. I think there's a lot of things that are key. When you first asked me this question, I interpreted it as what would be the biggest swing factor for the Rockets to win more in the second half of the season.
Well, we can go with that.
And so my answer to that is actually, and since I'm not going to be taking one of the young guys, I mean, I won't cut any corners. I'll just say it. I think it's Dillon Brooks' defense and Dillon Brooks' shot selection. I think if he can become the defensive stopper he was early in the season, a guy you put on the opposing team's best player, which we are doing anyways, but we're not getting nearly the same results. If he can, have that defense back and have the shot selection toned back to what it was back then, I think he's a massive plus for this team. And the fact that the Rockets, and scaling it into the future, the Rockets have invested in him for 4 years. The contract for the first half of the season looked like a really good contract. If these trends do not regress to a more positive state, I'm not sure that's a positive contract anymore. And the Rockets are in for it for 4 years. So both for the future and for this season, I think you even take a lot of pressure off of Alperen Şengün defensively by having Dylan Brooks be Dylan Brooks out there, because he's not just stopping the best guy. When he's off the ball, he was one of the best rotators on the team. He was playing help defense in an awesome way. And that helps, Şengün not be as exposed to drivers as he's been the last few games. So yeah, I'll go with Dylan Brooks. I think, he's a massive swing factor for this team, and especially with Tariq not being here. And yeah, that, like I said, coupled with the fact that he is a much more. I could have said a lot of the same things about Fred VanVleet, but he was much more of a long-term bet by the Rockets. They don't have an out after year 2. They have the full 4 years guarantee. So I'll go with Dylan.
Well, and I would also say that Fred is a little better when it comes to the leadership and the intangibles. Not that you give a guy 40 plus million for that annually, but there's still clearly some positive value when he's out there. Even if the play has regressed to some level, I don't think the 1-6 in the 7 games that he was out, and the 1 win, by the way, is under protest for the Knicks. I don't think with Dylan there's nearly the same intangible value that Fred clearly provides. I mean, when any of the young guys, if you've noticed, when people talk to Şengün about his jump or Jabari about what he's jumped in year 2, although I will say, if I had to give like Şengün for me was the clear answer, Dylan was for you. I think a good honorable mention would be Jabari Smith Jr., because by and large it's been a leap forward for him, but over the last 13 games, the shooting has jumped back to rookie levels. The defense has not gone back to rookie levels, thankfully. The shooting has. Hopefully that's just a blip based on random small sample and the ankle injuries. If for some reason it's not, then yeah, if Jabari's shooting in the low to mid 30s from 3 as opposed to, the high 30s and 40% he was when he was at his best, then you might feel a little bit differently about him going into year 3. But to circle back to Fred versus Dylan, when you hear Şengün, when you hear Jabari asked about their growth and what's taken them to the next level, it's always about the presence of a true point guard, a guy like Fred VanVleet that knows how to, get them the ball in their spots and avoid turnovers. And so he does so many things at the team level that even if they aren't captured in the box score, still has some value. Dylan's a guy where honestly for him, not saying he's a bad guy in the locker room, but I don't think he's leaned down to the extent that Fred is. It's more just, is he going to hold his weight defensively and win those one-on-one battles? And if he doesn't, and if he chucks bad shots, then he just doesn't have the other layers to his game to still provide positive value the way a guy like Fred does, right?
Yeah, although to different parts of the locker room, I think Dylan. I mean, you're in the building, so you know this better than me. But I would have expected Dylan to still have a pretty big.
Yeah, he does.
At least for the wings, right? At least for the wings.
Yeah, he does, and Tari has talked well of him, so it's not nothing. But yeah, I would just say that it's not quite to the extent that Fred is as far as establishing the culture, the leadership, and Ime's referred to Fred as basically a coach on the floor, and that's sorely missing in terms of organizing the offense when he's not in those games. So yeah, it's not to say that Dylan is not making a positive impact. It's just I wouldn't go to the extent that the Rockets do with Fred, and so because of that, it's harder to sort of give him the benefit of the doubt if the defense isn't there, if he's not making the shots the way you would with Fred, where even if we say, hey, there's been this slippage, it's not that you would give Fred a blank check and say, oh, he's worth it no matter what. No, there are some standards, but I think you just give Fred a little bit longer leash because just the way people talk about him and quite frankly, I've seen people on Twitter calling it CTE ball that the Rockets revert into when Fred isn't out there. It's just not nearly to the same extent with Dylan. And so because of that, yeah, I think there's probably more swing variance with Dylan over this last third than there is with Fred, who I think by and large, you're going to look at Fred as a clearly positive difference maker no matter what. And even if for some reason he isn't, even if for some reason there is a regression, then he's not as, he's expiring as soon as next season. It's not like you have him on a 4-year contract the way that you do with Dylan, and he's a little bit older. So for all those reasons, Dylan is probably a little bit more of a variable between the two of them for the final third. All right. And go ahead.
And to be fair to the CTE meme thing, and it's not like the offense looks really that good with Fred anyways. It's just, I think it's just I think it just comes down to coaching, and Ime's a defensive guy, and, hopefully they get someone in the offseason to help, make the offense better. It's not like they go from a really good offense to a garbage one. They go from a bad offense to a garbage one. So
yeah, it goes from being bad but tolerable to just being off the charts staggeringly bad at times. And so that's where you really notice it. And of course, combined with the aforementioned Şengün regression, not a big one offensively, but a little bit. And to your point, any regression offensively hits especially hard because when you're below average to begin with, it doesn't take much to go from below average to really, really bad, just difficult to watch. And that's what it felt like the Rockets were over the last week or so going into the All-Star break, punctuated by those awful losses in Toronto and Memphis that may have really just taken away any realistic chance they still had at a play-in tournament push this season. All right, well, we'll see if that's true. The Rockets, I will say, if somehow they go on a run over the next 5 or 6 games and the tougher part of their schedule, then even if it's 2% now, you can't write them off. There's enough basketball still to be played that, in theory, they could still salvage this, but it's definitely unlikely. And we'll probably get a quick answer out of the break when they have this back-to-back Thursday in New Orleans, Friday at home versus Phoenix. Do they look like a very different basketball team, or is it more of the same? If it's more of the same, then at some point you're probably going to see the Rockets shift into a little bit more of a development mode. Not immediately, but definitely down the home stretch of the season. At that point, you'd also have to consider the top 4 protection that you have on your pick to Oklahoma City, and maybe trying to maximize the odds of not just the Brooklyn pick, but even the Houston pick getting into the top 4 of the draft lottery, and somehow you end up with 2 lottery picks, maybe even 2 top 4 picks if you get insanely lucky. That's not something that's driving the Rockets now, but if it's clear that there's no play-in hopes, not just 2%, maybe it slips to 0% or 0.2, then yeah, at that point you may have to start making some hard decisions internally, and maybe that's when it makes a little bit more sense to actually pull the trigger on something more drastic, such as actually benching Jalen Green from the starting lineup. Time will tell. Anyway, we'll pick up those themes next week and in the weeks to come. We've gone on long enough for this, the part 2 of our All-Star break series of pods, talking a little more macro about where the Rockets are in the big picture, what they're trying to do at a high level strategically. We'll pick back up the micro in terms of what's going right, what's going wrong, hopefully more right, because things have definitely been a bit more wrong in recent pods. But yeah, whatever happens on a micro level, we'll pick that up more starting next week when we get back into game mode. Rockets have a lot of games in a short period coming up, starting with, of course, the back-to-back tonight in New Orleans and Friday at home against Phoenix. All right, so we'll break it here until next time. And if you want more from us in the interim, the best place to find that is on Twitter or X. Paolo's on there at Paolo Alves NBA. I'm on there at Ben Dubose. And this show, The Logger Line, is on there at The Logger Line, where if you go to twitter.com/The Logger Line, hit up the link showing the bio, you can find links to our friends, partners, and sponsors, Sports Talk 790, Carbach Brewing, USA Today's Rockets Wire, and also our distributors, Apple, Google, Spotify. If you've not already, leave a 5-star review, subscribe to the program. That's how you can get the benefit of episodes just as soon as they come out. And of course, we would greatly appreciate your support keeping us in business as one of the most regular podcasts covering Houston Rockets basketball. All right, with those plugs complete, we will sign off. For Paolo, I'm Ben. Thanks as always for listening, and please come back soon for another new episode of The Logger Line.